Welcome to Riset Day 2023. Today we have Professor Virginia Slaughter from University of Queensland, Australia. She's going to share with us about her research, or very interesting research on neonatal imitation. Before that, let me tell you a little bit about Professor Virginia. Professor Virginia is a professor of psychology at the University of Queensland, Australia, where she also the founder of the Early Cognitive Development Center. Her research focuses on social and cognitive development in infant and young children, with particular emphasis on social behavior in infancy, theory of mind development, and the acquisition of peer interaction skill. She is also a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. Welcome, Professor Virginia.
Thank you very much.
Today she is going to talk about very interesting research that we probably already read a lot on textbook. Her research also I would say provocative or controversial, and this is something that we can discuss after she shared about her research with us. Without further ado, I give the floor to you.
Thank you all for coming to listen. This is a topic that I've been working on now for over 10 years, and I hope that you'll find it as fascinating as I do. This talk, I'm going to give you some background going all the way back to the 1970s, and then I'm going to talk about some research that I've done, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of psychology research and how disagreements can occur and how we try to manage them as scientists. And then look at some future directions. To answer this question, do human infants imitate from birth? So I'll just start by setting the stage. Imitation is something that we do so naturally and so constantly that we almost forget that it is a core psychological and behavioral function. So human beings do it all the time, and we do it in many, many different contexts. It's been argued that our ability to imitate is what underpins our complex human culture and separates us from animals, because by imitating, we can adopt the skills and knowledge of the generations that have come before us. And that's how we build up our cumulative culture. We imitate the achievements of our forebears, and we build on those, and then our children imitate us, and it grows greater and greater and more complex. Imitation not only has this function of developing our knowledge base, but it also enhances our social interactions. So it is something that we do quite unconsciously. We copy the verbal mannerisms, the physical mannerisms of other people, and it's well known through experimental studies that people in interactions where there is this mirroring or copying going on, they think that the interaction is more pleasant and more smooth than if people are not mirroring or copying each other. Now, obviously, you don't take it too far. It can be very annoying if someone copies every single thing you say and do. We modulate it naturally. And there are studies showing that when we're with someone that we care about, we do tend to adopt similar mannerisms and movements. So imitation is really at the heart of our social interactions and our cognitive development. It takes many different forms, imitation. So you can imitate simple actions, you can imitate verbal sounds. You can imitate quite complex actions. But fundamentally, imitation has a cognitive problem at the center, which is known as the correspondence problem. So this term was coined by the philosopher Cecilia Hayes from Oxford University. She pointed out that in order to imitate, what you have to do is translate what you see someone else do into a motor program that matches. So that you have to make that correspondence between what you can see and what you're producing yourself. And although it comes to us quite naturally as adults, if you think about it, it's probably quite a complex problem for babies and young children who are just gaining control of their own bodies and just, becoming aware of other people and the way they move and the way they make sounds. Yeah. So if we go back to Piaget, excuse me, the founder of developmental psychology, his view was that imitation is a skill that is learned and that it takes a few months for babies to start imitating. He said that somewhere around the middle of the first year of life, babies would start to copy what they see other people do. And this tended to be in the context where they could see their own body and the other person's body moving at the same time. So clapping. Babies copy that quite early on because they can see someone clapping and then they can watch their own hands. And that way they can solve the correspondence problem and match things up. When they get older, they do more complicated sorts of imitation, including imitation of facial gestures at a later stage, sometime between 12 and 18 months. And as you can imagine, facial gestures are the hardest thing to imitate because you've got visual input of someone else's face and you can't see your own face unless there's a mirror somewhere around there, but that's not usually the case. So you have to translate what their face is doing into what your face is doing in order to match. So that is the hardest form of the correspondence problem. So that was Piaget's view, and that was, so Piaget's work was published outside of France, outside of Europe, starting in the mid-50s. And so for about 20 years, developmental psychologists had this view that imitation was something that was acquired over the first year of life. And then this very, very famous paper came out. I imagine that you have seen these pictures before in your textbooks or online. These are pictures of Andrew Meltzoff, professor of developmental psychology at the University of Washington, still a very active, extremely successful researcher. This was quite early in his career. He is pictured in the top row, gesturing to a newborn baby, and he's taken out some still images which seem to show that the baby is copying the gestures that he makes. And then shortly afterwards, another paper was published by Tiffany Field, where she reported imitation of facial expressions by newborn babies. And I'll just point out that the methodology that was pioneered by Meltzoff and by Field is one that we still use. So if you look at the graph on the left, on the x-axis, you've got the movements that the baby is making: widened lips, pouting lips, wide open mouth. And then the bars represent the gesture that the baby is watching. And so we consider it imitation when babies produce, for instance, more wide open mouths when the model is gesturing that, in this case a surprise face, than when the model is making other gestures. This is known as the cross-target comparison. You compare the performance of a gesture when the model matches and when the model does not match. And if you get more matching then you call it imitation. So Meltzoff and Moore did a number of follow-up studies to their initial famous paper. And from that, they developed a model that they called AIM, Active Intermodal Matching, where they said that humans are born with the ability to solve the correspondence problem. They said that humans have an innate common code that can translate between somebody else's body movements and their own body movements. And they've got a little model there over on the right-hand side, which has the visual perception of the target coming into the supramodal representation, the equivalence detector, leading to the output of matching infant motor activity. So the details aren't important. The theory is important. We're born with this ability to solve the correspondence problem. Now, you'll probably be aware that in the mid-1990s, there was a famous world-changing discovery out of Italy, which was the discovery of mirror neurons. So these are neurons that were discovered in the motor cortex of the macaque monkeys, where the researchers were doing single-cell recordings, and they discovered that certain cells had equivalently strong responses to seeing a hand do something and the animal doing the same thing with its hand. So those neurons in the brain that came to be called mirror neurons, they respond equally to a visual input of motor movement and the production of motor movement. And everybody said, wow, there you go. That is active intermodal matching. That is just what Meltzoff and Moore proposed human beings are born with. Now, it is the case that we have relatively little evidence of individual mirror neurons in the human brain. So far, there's only been one study that I'm aware of where there's been single-cell recordings in the human brain, and that was with someone who was undergoing surgery for epilepsy. There was evidence of mirror neuron activity there, but we know from other types of neuropsychological research using EEG and fMRI that there are human brain responses that are similar when we see an action and when we produce an action. So everyone got super excited about this and said, well, there you go. Mirror neurons are probably inborn, and that's why newborn babies can imitate, because they got the mirror neurons. They're there from the start. And I've just put in the bottom right corner of this slide something kind of interesting. So this is a graph of the citations to Meltzoff and Moore's 1977 paper. Over the course of, it goes from 1977 all the way up to the current day. And you can see that it was a pretty well-cited paper, pretty big news in the 70s and through the 80s. The citations were bubbling there at around, 50, 60 per year. Developmental psychologists, quite interested in this idea that babies can imitate from the time they're born. But then that big red arrow indicates the discovery of mirror neurons, the publication of those first papers on mirror neurons by Rizzolatti and then Gellis et al. And you can see that the citations to Meltzoff and Moore just went through the roof as a result of that. Because, as I said, people put two and two together and they said, well, if macaques have these kinds of neurons and these neurons do solve the correspondence problem through intermodal matching, then that must be what's going on with human babies. A bit of a leap, you might say, but it sounded really good and it fit nicely. Okay, this is a little bit of a complicated thing. I just want to point out that the idea of mirror pathways being part of the human brain has really taken off in the last 20, 30 years. And this is a model by Ferrari et al., published in 2009, which shows what they call direct and indirect mirror pathways. Because when you're thinking about mirror neurons as being the driver of imitation, you come upon the problem of we don't imitate everything. So if it's as simple as you see somebody do an action and then that produces a mirror response that creates the same action, it would be chaos. We would all be imitating each other all the time. So clearly that can't be the case. So what Ferrari et al. Are proposing is that there are two pathways that mirror neurons can operate within the brain. The direct mirror pathway is the one that I just described. You see it, it stimulates a matching motor response. And they said that that motor pathway is there in babies, and it's responsible for certain types of automatic imitation that we see in adults. But as we get older, the connection becomes more complex, and then is created what he called the indirect mirror pathway, which is that the sensory information comes in, you see somebody else make a movement, and instead of immediately copying it, it goes through the frontal cortex. And as we know, the frontal cortex is the part of the brain that is executive functioning and making decisions. And there you have a decision about whether or not it gets routed back to the motor cortex for copying or not. So that solves the problem of needing to explain why we don't imitate absolutely everything we see. I would point out that newborn babies don't imitate absolutely everything they see, but that was not addressed in this paper. So this all gave rise to a prominent and, I must say, very beautiful theory about human development, which Meltzoff called like me. And his argument was that human beings are born helpless and basically unable to communicate. And unlike with other mammals, they can't move. They have quite poor eyesight. They're really very uncoordinated because they're born, so immature. And so the idea was that nature has equipped our human babies with one thing that allows them to communicate and connect with other people, their caregivers, and that is through imitation. So the like me theory says that newborn babies, by imitating their caregivers, signal to the caregiver that I'm like you, I belong in this group. And as I said earlier on, we already know that social interactions that have an imitative element are felt to be more pleasant. You feel like you're closer to people who do things in the same way that you do. So the idea is that that's the key to our newborn baby survival, is imitating, demonstrating that they are part of the group. And then that ensures that caregivers will invest in them and take the best care of them possible.
Plan.
Further, it was argued that this basic connection that's forged through imitation is the foundation for all of our more complex social developments, including language, empathy, theory of mind. So it's a really very important theory about human development, resting on the idea that newborns can imitate. This is the way we test newborn imitation. I don't have the video to show you, but this is from a study that we did. You can see you hold the baby in your lap, and you get quite close so that they can focus on your face, and you gesture various gestures, opening your mouth, sticking out your tongue, waving your hand, and then you give the baby a period of time, and you see what gestures they produce, And if they produce more matching than non-matching gestures, you say that it's imitation. But you can imagine that it's pretty tricky to do that because newborn babies are quite uncoordinated and they're moving around all the time. They're producing lots of different sorts of gestures, so it can be hard to know if they have produced imitation or not. They don't copy, crisply and cleanly and immediately the way older children and adults do if they're asked to. So that's this whole background. Even though Meltzoff and Moore's study is cited in the textbooks, and, the pictures are published over and over, actually, if you dig into the literature like we did, you find out that it's been a controversial topic for 40 years. There are a number of good quality studies that tried to demonstrate neonatal imitation in the years after Meltzoff and Moore and failed to do so. It's quite interesting. Meltzoff and Moore's paper now has over 5,000 citations. These ones by Kopke et al., by McKenzie and Over. Nice, good quality studies with large samples. Didn't find evidence of imitation. They rarely get cited at all. Maybe 20, 30 citations. People don't like to be told what babies cannot do. They like to be told what babies can do. And there are very few longitudinal studies. It has been suggested that the reason that some of those studies were unable to replicate the effect is that there could be individual differences. So it's the case with all human traits, right? That we vary in the extent to which we express those traits. So maybe there are just individual differences in neonatal imitation. And this is an idea that was actually supported by the one longitudinal study that was published in the late 80s by Hyman et al., where they tested babies on neonatal imitation. They identified some of them as being imitators on the basis that they did more matching than non-matching gestures. And then at the end of 3 months, they evaluated their interactions with their mothers, and they found that the imitators looked more at their mother's face in social interaction at 3 months. So they proposed that this ability to imitate at birth is stronger in babies who are more social, or babies who are more social are better imitators. It's not a causal thing. It's an associative thing. And so those same babies that are strong imitators are more socially attentive to their mothers at 3 months. That's the proposal. So my team at the University of Queensland came into this because we noticed all of those citations to Meltzoff and Moore. The vast majority of them were from the neurosciences, social science, any kind of literature that was talking about mirror neurons. They were just wildly citing Meltzoff and Moore and saying mirror neurons are there at birth. But our team are developmental psychologists, and we knew that there was this big controversy. So we thought, well, maybe the controversy can be cleared up if we do a proper longitudinal study. We will test babies at 1, 3, 6, and 9 weeks. We're going to do a range of different gestures. All of the things that people have previously said newborn babies would imitate, we'll give them every chance to imitate. And then we're also going to follow them up and see if the individual differences in imitation in the newborn period are related to, say, language acquisition or empathy or theory of mind, the way Meltzoff's like me theory proposed. So it's a good proposal, and so we got funding for it, and we went out and tested 106 newborn babies. This woman at the bottom, who was also in the picture I showed you before with the baby on her lap, that's Janine Austenbrook. She was my PhD student at the time. She led the study. She is, by the way, now a counseling psychologist working with mothers and newborn babies. She led the study, and that's what we did. We went to people's houses, tested, and these were the parameters. Because we were testing the like-me theory, we made the conditions very naturalistic. So they were tested in their home after a nap and feeding. As you could see, they were videotaped. The baby's responses were coded by 2 independent scorers who did not know what the model was doing. All they could see was the baby. So they just ticked off, yep, stuck out his tongue. Yep, stuck it out again. Yep, stuck it out again. Oh, waved his fingers. Yep, waved him again, waved him again. And then we scored the number of target gestures that infants produce towards each model, and one of the models would be the matching one. And this is what we find. So we did generalized linear modeling on this, and what happened was we failed to uncover any strong evidence for imitation of any of our 9 gestures. Nothing. So if you can see those graphs on the right-hand side, there's a red line, and the red line, okay, so, sorry, on the x-axis of the graph, that is the testing time. So we've got 4 different testing times, 1, 3, 6, and 9 weeks. And then on the y-axis is the frequency of producing a gesture. And then there are 9 lines on each of the graphs, the red line being the frequency of producing the matching gesture. And so the black lines are the frequency of the gesture being produced in response to a different gesture that doesn't match. And you can see that nowhere does the red line float very much higher above the other ones, which is what you would expect if babies were imitating. The upper left-hand one, which is tongue protrusion, is the closest one we get. But even there, the difference between tongue protrusions that babies make in response to the other models is only significant in response to some of the models, not all of them. So when we protrude our tongue at a baby, they protrude their tongue. But when we frown at a baby, they also protrude their tongue. When we wave our fingers at a baby, they also protrude their tongue. So we were pretty devastated, frankly, by this finding because we spent a lot of money, we spent a lot of time, and we thought, well, God, now we're going to have nothing to show for it because look at those papers from, Kopke et al. And McKenzie and Over. Nobody pays attention to them. So first of all, we tried a bunch of different analyses. We looked at whether babies were paying attention to the model, and we looked at whether babies were in a good temperamental state. The data were good. The analyses were correct. So we wrote it up for Science, and they said, no, thank you, rejected it. Wrote it up for, then we tried other journals, and we finally ended up at Current Biology. And I'll be honest, the fact that we got it into Current Biology was luck. That was because one of us on the team knows the editor, and he wrote to the editor and explained why this is an important paper. And then another piece of luck is that when the paper went out for review from Current Biology, one of the reviewers was Cecilia Hayes, that philosopher who coined the term correspondence problem. And she thought that this was an incredibly important study because it is actually the most watertight, statistically sound neonatal imitation study that has ever been done. So it ended up getting accepted for publication, and Cecilia Hayes wrote a little article to go alongside it. So that paper from Current Biology got quite a bit of international attention. It was cited and blogged about and tweeted about, and that was quite exciting. 717 is the altmetric score, which is a big one. And then we had an interesting situation where Meltzoff himself, with his colleagues, including Ferrari, who, produced that direct and indirect mirror model, and some others, including Hyman, who did that only longitudinal study prior to ours. They all got together in kind of a little gang, and they approached us and said, hey, we want to see your data. We're not sure you did it right. And we said, okay, fair enough. And we handed over our data. And what they did was they reanalyzed it. And then they published a paper in Developmental Science titled Re-examination of Ostenbrook et al., Evidence for Neonatal Imitation of Tongue Protrusion, where they did a different sort of analysis, one that we did not think was appropriate. And they claimed that there was evidence for tongue protrusion. What they did was they averaged the response to all the other models, but that's not the way we do things. We use a cross-target comparison, and we compare responses to tongue protrusion to responses to all of the individual other models, not averaged together. Be that as it may, they tried to say, oh, look, these people don't even know how to take care of their own data. There is evidence for tongue protrusion if you analyze it our way. But then the bulk of the paper was criticizing our methodology. So they said that we did 11 things in our method that biased our study against finding imitation in newborn babies. So this is what I've just told you. So they reanalyzed, they concluded there was tongue protrusion, and then they said, flaws in Ostenbrook et al.'s experimental design biased the results toward null effects. So they said too many stimuli were presented. Babies got confused with 9 different models. Well, we reported that there were no order effects in the data. So if there were too many stimuli presented, we would have seen some order effects whereby there was imitation of, say, the first 2 or 3 models, but not the later models. That was not in our data. Then they said the stimulus and response periods were too brief, but in fact, we had 60 seconds in total, and that was even more than what Meltzoff and Moore had reported in their original study back in 1977. They said that putting the babies in the adult's lap, like the image I showed you, was a big mistake, that it resulted in poor postural support. In fact, there's no consensus on this in the literature. You find that infant seats are associated with both positive and negative results. And you have to wonder, if nature has equipped us with this ability, why would it rely on some modern contraption like an infant seat? Infants should not have seen the model before the imitation test. This was another criticism that they made of our study. But in fact, there's no consensus in this point either. And in fact, Meltzoff himself has said each of 3 things. Neonates should be unfamiliar with the model. Imitation is not modified by which person serves as the model. And infants imitate more to familiar faces. He has said each of those 3 things in different papers. So there is no consensus, even within that one individual. So we read that paper and we were frustrated because we felt like they weren't addressing the real issue, which is that if this is a robust ability that is the foundation for all social interaction, it should not be so hard to see it, right? It's supposed to be that mothers and caregivers are seeing it all the time. Why then is it so hard to find in the lab? But their basic argument was, we did not do a careful enough study. So then we thought, well, if Meltzoff et al. Are correct that the methodological details are crucially important to finding the effect, then we should be able to do a meta-analysis where we look at the moderating effect of these methodological decisions. So the next thing we did was not testing babies, but meta-analysis. So here we collected the effect sizes from the 33 independent samples that had been published. It's over 2,000 babies all up. We extracted the overall effect size, we tested moderators, and we assessed for bias. So the overall effect size, when all these studies are combined, is significantly greater than 0. So this is you probably know it's a forest plot. So on the left-hand axis are all of the papers that provided effect sizes for this meta-analysis. And then along the y-axis is the effect size. The 0 effect is where the red dotted line is. So that's where the 0 is. And the average overall effect is where the black dotted line is. And that's at 0.68, which is significantly different from 0. Although you can see that a lot of the studies just cluster on the 0 line, the 0 effect line. And there are a few studies that have really quite wildly big effects, which are certainly impacting the overall effect size. Then, this was the real thing that we were interested in, where we tested 13 potential methodological moderators. So we went through all of those studies and we coded the length of gesture presentation, the length of infant response period, whether the baby was sitting in a baby seat or not, whether the baby had seen the model prior to the gestures, etc. All of the things that Meltzoff and his colleagues criticized about ours, and also some more general methodological moderators that are known to have an effect when you're testing preverbal infants. We were very careful about this analysis, and when it was all said and done, not a single one of them had a significant effect on the overall effect size that we collected through the meta-analysis. None of them made any significant difference. So this is now evidence that it doesn't matter whether the baby's on your lap or in an infant seat. It doesn't matter whether you gesture to him for 60 seconds or 120 seconds. My colleague, Jack Davis, who led this meta-analysis, she presented this at a statistics conference. And in the question period, she was asked whether she had looked at research group as a potential moderator. So what you do here is you code an additional variable, which is who reported these data. So it turned out that of the 33 effect sizes that we had, there were basically 16 labs that were responsible for them. And when you look at lab as a moderator, what you find is that only 6 of the 16 labs produce aggregated results that are greater than 0. 10 out of the 16 labs find no effect. So that's the 0 effect is the dotted line on the left. The light gray dots are the effect sizes out of those 10 labs. And then the overall effect is in the dotted line of red. And you can see that there are some laboratories that meet and exceed that overall effect. So this is a bit confounding. Is it the fact that 6 out of 16 labs know how to do it right and the rest of us don't? Or is it that 6 out of the 16 labs don't know what they're doing, but somehow they're doing something important to finding the effect? Or is it possible that 6 out of the 16 labs are introducing some sort of bias into their testing such that they're finding what they want to find? I will point out that our lab is one of the light gray ones, and Meltzoff and Moore's lab, of course, is one of the black ones. This is a funnel plot, which you're probably familiar with. A funnel plot takes all of the effect sizes and plots them. So these aren't the overall 33 overall effects. These are the all the individual effects, and plots them where the standard. So basically, with a funnel plot, the more precise studies are plotted at the top because they have smaller standard errors, and they're plotted against the effect size, which ranges from 0 all the way up on the x-axis. So that's why you get a funnel, because most of the studies land at the top when they're good quality studies. That is normally with tighter methodologies, or usually it's just a matter of large sample sizes. They tend to hover towards the top, and then the poorer quality studies, where you've got smaller samples or less tightly controlled methodologies, they tend to sort of spread out down the bottom. So what this funnel plot suggests is that there is publication bias in this literature, because the good quality studies at the top, they are both on the positive and negative side of the 0 effect. But the poor quality studies that are spread down the bottom, they're only on the positive effect size. Now, there are also poor quality studies that showed no effect, but those ones we can't capture because they weren't published. So that's why this kind of a asymmetrical funnel plot is considered to be indicative of publication bias. Because if it's a good quality study, it's in the literature, it's up the top. If it's a poor quality study, it's only in the literature if it has a positive effect. And the other thing to notice on this, I don't know if you can see it, is that there are certain effects of poor quality studies that have circles around them. Those are Meltzoff and Moore's original effects from the 1977 paper. Those are outliers. They are very, very strong effects with very, very tiny samples. And this is what is sometimes known as the founder effect. It is the case in psychology that a big splashy result is most often the strongest effect comes from the original set of studies that produced that result. So conclusions from our meta-analysis, don't forget there was a positive overall result in the literature, but there is evidence of publication bias. There's a suggestion of some sort of bias in the way different labs are collecting their data, and there is no evidence that the methodological factors that were cited as being crucial to finding the effect, there's no evidence that they make a difference. So do humans imitate from birth? Our best answer at this stage is actually we don't know. Our studies suggest not, but then the meta-analysis suggests an overall effect. So it's hard to say. We need to do more research. There are some other pieces of evidence, though, that have started to come in from different directions. So there was a very important paper published in 2017 in Behavioral and Brain Sciences by Nazim Kevin and Kathleen Akins, where they analyzed newborn babies' control over their mouth and tongue. And they pointed out that in the newborn period, there is not sufficient control of the mouth and tongue to produce gestures in response to sensory input. So their analysis showed that when newborn babies have, in the first couple of weeks of life, they're still trying to coordinate breathing air and swallowing liquid. In utero, it's both the same thing. But once they come out, they got to breathe air and not swallow, and they got to swallow and not breathe in order not to choke themselves. And this requires a kind of rewiring. And part of the rewiring process, according to this analysis, is that newborn babies are doing what they called motor stereotypies. And you would have seen this. They're constantly like opening and closing their mouths and sticking their tongue out and pulling it in and sticking their tongue out and pulling it in. If you watch newborn babies, that's what they do. And Kevin and Aiken said that is all controlled by the subcortex. And even if mirror neurons were trying to get a look in there, they wouldn't be able to, because that subcortical activity is overriding anything coming from the motor cortex, which is where mirror neurons are located. So that's a very interesting and important finding. So where to from here? Well, we think it's time to consider alternative views, namely that babies learn to imitate, just like Piaget said originally. Cecilia Hayes and her colleague Ray has written a big paper for behavioral and brain sciences proposing that associative learning can solve the correspondence problem. They argue that when there is simultaneous excitation of sensory and motor representations, then that creates mirror associations that ultimately become the mirror neuron system in the human brain. So infants watch their hands all the time. They get the visual input of a hand, and they get the sensory motor input of their moving hand. They look at themselves in mirror. Modern babies do, and in fact, they're quite obsessed with mirrors. And perhaps the most important one, parents imitate them. There's evidence that parents imitate their babies once every 2 minutes in face-to-face interaction. So babies are being mirrored all the time, which gives them the experience of seeing somebody do it and doing it themselves. It's just that it's not been initiated. The copying wasn't initiated by them. The copying was initiated by the caregiver. So a little bit more on that. When babies get into face-to-face interaction with their caregivers, as you know, they get very excited. This is their favorite thing to do. They're highly aroused. They respond well to faces. They attracted to faces. Caregivers imitate the baby, and this is something we're investigating now, but by all accounts, once every 2 minutes. That gives the baby the experience of the contingent representations of seeing and doing, and that creates a powerful feedback loop that can be the foundation for mirror neurons. So this is my last slide. Where are we going with this now? We are doing additional work on this. We are leading a study in the international consortium of infant labs called Many Babies, where we're developing a new protocol for neonatal imitation, which is then going to be open to any researcher anywhere in the world to collect data and send the data in for analysis. This is the 6th international project that has been sponsored by this Many Babies Consortium, which is located at Stanford University, but it's an international project. I told you we're leading it. Guess who is co-leading it with us? Andy Meltzoff. Which I think is fantastic. I'm so excited about that, because if we did it without him or vice versa, there's a lot of mistrust there. But if we do it together, then whatever the outcome, we'll both have to accept it. So I'm very excited about that. Another thing that we're doing is testing neonatal imitation, but we're using EMG. So instead of trying to watch the baby and figure out what they're doing, we are collecting their motor activity through AMG, and we're also doing some correlational studies looking at babies' experience with mirrors and parents' imitation of babies and how that relates to imitation. We want to do some cross-cultural studies because the rate of imitation of babies probably differs across cultures, and the types of gestures that people find socially acceptable to imitate also differ across cultures. And then finally, we want to do some training studies. So I always thank the 106 mothers and babies who allowed us into their homes for testing for that very first study that we did. We went to their houses 4 different times, and then we didn't find any evidence of imitation, but it was still an important finding. The Australian Research Council has funded this research, and this is the team who did the first study and the meta-analysis. These are my colleagues. They're not all at the University of Queensland anymore. Yep. And then, I thought I had a final slide that said, thank you very much for listening.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Slaughter, for exciting, interesting, but yet controversial a study and sharing it with us. I'm intrigued about this study. Science has evolved, right? And from the beginning, Piaget said that infant can imitate starting about 6 months on. But then Murdoch came with his study, and if you look at the textbook, majority of his study has been cited on the textbook, and he believed that infant can do more than what Piaget stated before. But then with this study, it's kind of come back to what Piaget said. But then the verdict is not yet out. Whether infant can imitate as early, right? Or we don't know.
Yes.
Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. So what's the implication? I think this study opened the possibility and also changed what we believe all this time about what infant can and cannot do. So in terms of the imitation, what might be the implication about what infant can do in terms of the first 3 years of life, especially about the imitation. Because right now there's a controversy, right?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for asking that, because we received some quite poignant responses to the paper we published in Current Biology, the one that showed that imitation was not evident in the large sample of babies. We actually had people writing to us saying, oh, thank goodness for your finding. I have a newborn baby. She's 3 months old now. She's never imitated anything. I thought maybe she was autistic.
Okay.
And we felt like, oh my goodness, it is very important that people understand that just because the textbook says this is what your newborn will do, well, in this particular case, it's a controversial phenomenon that wasn't clear. But even when you have something that, you know, all normal babies develop, like walking, there's a big curve around the age of attainment. But if you say that something is present at birth, there's no wiggle room there. So, you know, caregivers who are watching their babies and not seeing evidence of this supposedly foundation of all social interaction, naturally they got quite worried. So I think that's one positive thing, even though we can't say it's not there absolutely, the jury is still out, at least we can say there's variation. Certainly not all babies do it in the way that is suggested by those images that appear in the textbooks. More broadly, I personally think it's quite exciting to think about how it is that we teach our children, consciously or unconsciously, to imitate. Again, it's the foundation of social interaction and learning, and it's something that we all learn to do. So how do we consciously or unconsciously create an environment whereby they pick up this skill? That's a fascinating question. That will lead to a lot of research. Nobody's done any research on that since 1977 because everybody just assumed that it was there at birth.
Maybe right. Another follow-up question. The question of how baby learns to imitate. That's we haven't discovered it yet, right? And from the research, the interaction between the caregiver and the baby, that's kind of stimulate the ability for the baby to imitate. So, in your mind, going back again to how important it is, the how, but we don't know yet, the interaction between the caregiver and the baby and how it can stimulate the development of the imitation baby. Do you think that might be the direction that the research might find? I don't know, maybe that's another alternative.
Absolutely.
Finding the how.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's one really good direction that we can look at. I said that there's evidence that mothers imitate their babies once every 2 minutes. But this comes from really just scouring the literature on mother-infant interaction, where the emphasis has been on emotional responses, or verbal responses, and imitation has just been a like an incidental thing that they measured. So the first thing to do, I think, and this is one thing that we're doing currently, is to really get an idea of how common it is for mothers to imitate their babies. I mean, I notice it all the time because, of course, I'm really attuned to it. But, I'll see mothers pushing their babies in a pram down the street, and the baby makes a noise, and the mother copies that noise. Or the baby makes, a funny face, and the mother copies that funny face. I think it's very, very common. And what happens is the mother copies the baby, and then the baby might copy the mother back because he's already sort of making that face, and now he's got a connection with what he sees. And then that creates this loop where it's not clear who's imitating who, and that's how perhaps you can get this foundation, this mirroring foundation that then leads to later forms of imitation. But it's all up for grabs. I mean, I think that mirror experience is probably also important. Self-observation, very important. I think these are all potential mechanisms for imitation. And, Ray and Hayes proposed that it's a simple associative mechanism. That's a possibility. Potentially there are, other things, like, for instance, there could be a predisposition for mirror activity in the motor cortex that we just don't yet understand. It might not be already ready, but maybe it's a very quick developmental trajectory when certain sorts of inputs are available. We just don't really know yet.
Yes, there's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot that the researcher needs to do a lot of study, right? Especially all the things that the infant can learn and develop. Okay, thank you so much, Professor Slaughter, for the very interesting and very enlightening, I would say, research. And we will wait for another research. And hopefully, you said you were doing a research together with Andy Matlock, right?
Well, yeah, so I would just like to say you can get involved because once the Many Babies project is formally launched, when we have a protocol, then it will be made available to all researchers around the world who are interested in testing babies. So if you want to test some babies and send us some data, we would appreciate it very, very much.
Okay, and the more babies that we can,
the more the better.
Okay, thank you so much again for sharing it with us. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.